Please welcome Mr. McWilliams to tell us the history of the canal.
Thank you. Today I'm going to be taking you from the basin in Northumberland up the West Branch down the Susquehanna Division and up the North Branch Canal with photographs, actual pictures of the canal. We'll be going into the ruins of the canal. You'll see the ruins. You'll see how they were constructed, the canals. I got interested in history at a very young age because, believe it or not, my relatives were the third white person to see the Susquehanna Valley in 1720. They came down as a scout for Conrad Weiser. I got interested in the canals, as she said, because I was in Kiwanis. I was in charge of programs, and I wanted to get a program on the canals from the Packwood House Museum, and the fellow got transferred. So, being a painting contractor, I got a gift certificate from a lady, and I went to Country Cover, and I bought my first book in 1989. It was called The Amazing Pennsylvania Canals by Bill Shank. And after that, I joined the Pennsylvania Canal Society. I've been doing these programs since about 1990. So with that, I'll start from the basin and we'll go through the thing. The person I portray is Captain Mick, because the last name's McWilliams. The first slide you're going to see is the earliest known drawing of the basin in Northumberland. It is a crayon drawing. It's owned by the Davis family. You can see the weight lock there on the left-hand side. That was where they weighed the boats. They were weighed much like coal trucks, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. And this is a steel etching. Doesn't show up real good because we have a light coming in here, but this is a bridge coming across into Northumberland right here from Blue Hill. There's a little tavern here. You can hardly see it. That was Gibbons Tavern. Of course, they used rafts, arcs, and flatboats in the river. It was declared a public highway in 1771. The canal would be right here, and the towpath used to be on the riverside. And you'll see that in a little while with better pictures. This is a diagram coming around Blue Hill. This was the beginning of the Susquehanna Division Canal right here. Ran 39.5 miles to Clark's Ferry. You come across the bridge, which the bridge was built in 1831 by Reuben Fields, and it was built for the West Branch Division Canal, which runs this way. That's the West Branch Canal. If you were going up the North Branch through Danville, you'd come across this bridge right here, up the towpath, past the weight lock, and right there is the North Branch Canal. And you'll see some pictures of that later. The tollkeeper's house stood until 1972 flood, and then they had to tear it down. The new bridge itself runs right over top of the locks, where they used to be. This is an actual picture of the canal. This is the weight lock again. There's the cradle. And as I said, they weigh them like coal trucks. In the spring, they'd weigh the boats empty. And then when they come through with cargo on, they'd weigh them again and subtract the weight, and that would be the toll that they would pay. You would see here that there's a bridge going across onto Blue Hill. You'd enter the basin through the locks right here. And here you can see a boat that's unloaded and a boat that's loaded. Now they're set in the water. The boats themselves were 85 feet long, 15 feet wide, and weighed about 100,000 pounds. In later years, they could carry 130 tons of cargo. They cost about $800 to build, and they were made out of white oak and red oak, and they probably took 6 to 7 months to build. There's another picture of the basin. The basin is like a parking lot for boats where they would get their orders, load and unload. They had the tollkeeper's house, they had the lock tender's house, they had a stable and a store, usually a store at every lock, run by the lock keeper. Here's a picture off of Shikellamy Lookout. At one time the railroad bridge was covered too. These are the bridges that are there today, but they're different now. They were covered. There's 5 covered bridges here. The little short one here over the North Branch, the one over the West Branch here, and this one here built by Reuben Fields. There's the lock tender's house right there and the tollkeeper's house. And there again, they towed them across the river and into these locks here. One was a double lock, which could take 2 boats through at a time, chained together, and the other one was a single lock. Here's another picture of the basin looking down into the river. And these boats were lifted 13.5 feet from the Susquehanna River up into the basin. Here's your North Branch towpath that come up to Danville right here. You get an idea where this weight lock was. The railroad bridge still stands today, the same bridge. There's the weight lock, and there would be the cradle. They would pull them into this thing here. They would drain the water out, and they would settle down on the cradle, and they would weigh them. This is a weight lock bill. Here you can see there's the cargo boat with the cargo. There's a light weight, which would be the weight of the boat, and that's where you pay toll. This is Captain Archibald went through in 1844. Here was the toll collector's place where he sat. Everybody paid a toll. Passengers, horse riders, carriages, The pedestrians went on this side, the mules went on this side, and they had one way each way for carriages and wagons, horses. They collected so many tolls when they opened the canal in 1831 that they started the Bank of Northumberland. Not the same bank as the Northumberland National Bank, but that charter eventually in the 1860s got taken to Sunbury, became Sunbury National Bank, and now it's Susquehanna Bank today. You can see Joseph Priestley's grandson was involved with this bank in Northumberland here, and a fellow by the name of Taggart, who was a big distiller in our area. There's a lot of distillers because they could ship whiskey a lot cheaper than they could ship the grain. So they make whiskey out of it, and it would be worth more and ship cheaper. When the canals opened, the freight costs dropped by 2/3. That's how important it was. It used to take 25 days to get across the state with a Conestoga wagon, carrying about a ton of merchandise. Once the canals were open, they could go day up until 10 o'clock at night from 5 in the morning, and they could make the trip across there in about 6-7 days. This is the mule way here on the bridge, and I want to explain to you how this worked. They had a thing called a bridge stick, which the fellow on the mules would have this stick, and this would be the railing of the bridge, which would be right here. They would put this against the rope, would come around here and go down to the river to the boat because the current's going this way, and they didn't want to pull mules off the towway. So they wrapped the rope around here and then two the mules, and this would act as a focal point as they slid it along. And that was called a bridge stick to get across the bridges. There was a crew of 3 people normally in a boat. It was the captain or the owner. He would be on the tiller and bark out the orders. There would be a boatsman. He would be on the front of the boat. He would handle all the lines, and he did most of the cooking. And then there would be the mule skinner, they call him, on the ground, which was a boy young as 10 to 12 years old, that would walk about 25, 30 miles a day with the mules. He'd get relieved to eat meals by the boatsman. Here's a picture of the bridge on the Blue Hill side. Here again is where the mules came across on this mule way. And then this is where the pedestrians came. And in later years, there's a little tiny train station right here that you can catch a train to Lewisburg. There's a picture off of Blue Hill again. This is the DL&W freight yards right here, which isn't there now. And this is a Pensy River station. They both shared that passenger station for passenger travels. But they had a roundhouse here, a water tower, and stuff at the DL&W. Here again is the lock coming in the tollkeeper's house. You can see the North Branch Canal coming this way. This is Joseph Burke. He was the first lock tender the last lock tender at the lock in Northumberland Basin. And he's buried in the Riverside Cemetery. He was a Civil War veteran member of the GAR, which a lot of them Civil War veterans got jobs on the canals after the war was over. This is the Van Kirk House. This is a hotel that they stayed in. If they came into the locks in Norian Basin, they didn't want to stay on the boats. They would come up here to stay in this hotel. It's on Front and Queen Street. Later on, it became a big railroading hotel. Now it's in an apartment building. Here's a picture looking down King Street. This is the old Moose building here, which was actually the Bank of Northumberland at one time. This is May Burr's Tavern right here. And her uncle was Theodore Burr, who invented the Burr Arch Bridge. And there's an interesting story about this tavern. When the Moose bought that tavern and tore it down, somebody went up into the attic and they found the original patent model for the Thomas Burr Arch Bridge. And so they rescued it and they took it to Harrisburg. This is a little bridge right here going across the North Branch Canal. This is a Davis funeral home, Jerry Blank's funeral home today. And that's the steel house. There was big in lumber in our area. This is a Joseph Priestley house. The canal ran right behind his house, but he never lived to see it. He died in 1802, and the canal wasn't built until 1829 and opened in 3031. Once the canals opened, they weren't ready for travel right away. They leaked. So some of the branches took over a year to get them ready that they could actually use them because they would have leaks in them and faulty workmanship. A lot of the canals were let out to farmers along the way to build a section of canal. You could bid on the work, and some of the work wasn't done the way it should be. The canals themselves were 40 feet wide at the top, 28 feet wide at the bottom. They started out 4 feet deep, and in later years they were up to 7 feet deep because of the draw of the boat when it was loaded in the bigger boats. They were lined with a clay puddling, which is a clay and gravel mixture. That's why they were watertight. This is a picture of the lock number 1 on the North Branch Canal. This lock is here today. You'll see it in a few minutes. This would be the channel going through now. This is a double lock here now. It was a single lock until 1879. The railroads bought the canals in 1857 from the state of Pennsylvania. The state of Pennsylvania spent $22 million building the canals and many, many million dollars maintaining them because of floods and damage. They tried to sell them for $10 million. The railroads went to it. When they came up down to $7.5 million, the railroad bought it. That's why you see the railroad tracks running along the canals, because the right-of-ways were already taken up by the canal company. They named the canal Pennsylvania Canal in 1857, the railroads. This is a bypass right here. Much like your bathroom sink has the holes in to keep it from overflowing, this is the same thing. It would let water go around the lock when it was in use and also keep the lock chamber from overflowing. This is a picture of lock number 1 in the North Branch Canal. These rubble stone locks were lined with wood. You can see these slots here. They had timbers running up and down the slots, and they were planked this way to keep them watertight. There was only 2 foot of clearance this way and 2.5 foot of clearance this way on each end of the lock. So they worked pretty quick when they filled them with water. You could pass the lock in about 5 minutes once they got you in there. This is the lock tender's house. Every canal lock had a lock tender. This would be his threshold right there. And believe it or not, somebody took that. It's not there now. The canal was right on the other side of that mound. This is his well. Here's the lock again. The lock tender's house would be right here. You can see the recesses here where the doors swing back into the canal, so they have room. This is a picture of the canal today. It still holds water because of that clay puddling. They were built by Irish immigrants for pennies a day. But they got a shot of whiskey every hour, and they were happy about that. Again, they were lined with clay puddling. They would dig them out and make this towpath. And as you come up Route 11, you can see that towpath very plainly. It's as straight as an arrow. One Irishman in a day's time had to dig into this canal 3 foot by himself, which would be 40 foot at the top, 28 foot at the bottom, and 4 foot deep. 3 foot into that he had to do. That was his labor for the day. So they worked hard. This is Johnson's Run right here. There was an aqueduct right here. An aqueduct is a water-filled bridge, which would take the canal over creeks, so they wouldn't have to depend on the flow of the waters in the creeks. There's a picture of the ruins in just a minute. There was a big log pool here. There was a sawmill there. And this house still stands today. It belongs to David Ramsey. He does Native American history. This is the canal prism at that aqueduct. You can see the canal right there very plainly. This stonework here is the aqueduct stonework. This stonework here is the railroad that runs up there along there now. Here's a picture of your lock in Danville. There isn't much left of your lock, and upon a lot of research, I found out that the WPA borrowed the stones to do projects, so you don't have too much left of it. But that was lock number 2. There's some nice postcards and pictures of it. This is at Indian Head on the way to Catawissa. You can see, you can't see the guys on here because of the light, but there's the mule and the people are here, the boats here, there's a railroad here, and the road right here. This is SB Boatyard. This was a company boatyard. After the railroad bought the canal, they established boatyards here and there to build their own boats called company boats. Company boats were numbered. The private boats had names on them. This company boats here, there's nothing left of this site at all. I've been there. You wouldn't even know it was ever there. This is what the North Branch Canal was all about, coal. The North Branch Canal hauled an awful lot of coal. That's why they changed the locks from single locks to double locks, because they could chain 2 boats together and carry 260 ton of coal at a time down to the point in Northumberland where they would be loaded on railroad cars or else continue up the Susquehanna Division to different destinations. This actually is a picture of Columbia, but it represents the same as they had in Nanticoke. They had people called coal heavers that would load and unload those boats, and they did that all by hand. So you can imagine that was really a tough job. Now this is the outlet lock into the Susquehanna River at Northumberland after the days of the canal. That came from the Sidney Davis collection. That's a photograph. You don't get too many photographs of the canal because, as you know, photography didn't come until about the 1860s and privately until about the 1880s. So there isn't many real photographs of the canal unless a professional did it, and that would be later years. Here's the bridge. Here's Northumberland. Here's the bridge coming across. Now we're going to enter the Susquehanna Division Canal. That canal was filled by a dam built at the exact same position as the Faber Dam today. There's a rock ledge that runs across there called the Shamokin Riffles, and that's what they anchored the dam to. That raised the water into the area here and filled this canal all the way to Clark's Ferry, 39.5 miles. Now they did have some slack water navigation along here, and I'll show you that in a minute. There again is a picture of the opening into the canal. Years ago, the towpath was on this side. Then they moved it to this side later on. Here is Clement's freight station around Blue Hill, and the railroad. This is in later years. Telephone poles are up, so you know it's later years. This is a picture of Blue Hill here. Now here is the canal on the river side. And then later on they changed it to that side. This was probably a Sunday because when the canals first opened they weren't allowed to boat on Sundays. But later on they opened it up on Sundays. Now if you're going around Blue Hill from Ted's Landing over into Northumberland, you'll see these stones out in the river. That is the old canal towpath, and this is the prism here of the canal. You'll see it in various spots. There's a good picture of the towpath when it was on the riverside, and these are all stones here to keep the river from ruining the canal. But unfortunately, it didn't work on many floods, and they had a lot of damage. Every farmer, every street had a little footbridge it went across to get the land on the other side. And that was quite costly to keep those up at that time, too. There's another picture of the canal prism and the towpath. Still, you can see that when the water's down. There's another. This is all filled with silt, but there's the canal. These were usually 5 foot wide, all laid up by hand. Now this is the winding bridge. This is where they changed the towpath from one side of the canal to the other. Years ago when I was a kid, there used to be a house trailer sitting right here in this mound. It looked like it was sitting out in the river on a mountain. And now it's a boat landing now. But if you go over there to that area and look back under the road, you can see here's the canal, and there's where the trailer was. And if you look under the road, there's the pier on the other side, right under Route 11. This is the dam. It cost $100,000 to build. It was 9.5 feet high. It was made of wooden cribs filled with stones and anchored to that rock ledge by big iron anchorings. Here's another picture of the dam. Now when they built these dams, they had to have a sluice on one side. On the Sunbury side, there was a 60-foot wide sluice where rafts, arts, and riverboats could still go down the river because they weren't allowed to block the river. In fact, when they decided to build the Pennsylvania Canal and put these dams at Nanticoke, Muncie, and Northumberland, New York State got very upset with them. They said we were cutting off their trade because they used the river so much to bring goods in. Here's a picture from one of the cribs on the dam. There is the ferry house. There's the winding bridge. This was one of Ara Clement's steamboats. He would tow coal across the river from Sunbury area, come down from Paxinus over to get on the canal boats. Here is a picture of Grant's schoolyard on the Sunbury side. You can see that railroad right here. That was a horse-driven railroad. They would pull the cars down in the morning by horses and send them back empty in the afternoon by horses. It was the earliest railroad in the area. It was about 1831, Gravity Railroad. Here you can see one of the canal boats being loaded. Then Ara Clement would drag that across, and there was a 100-foot opening over there where he could get into the canal on the northern side here. Here's one of the steamboats that pulled the canal boats. They pull a couple at a time. Now this is the first lock on the Susquehanna Division Canal. This lock only had one gate. It was called a guard lock. And the guard locks were used to control flooding, and also if there was a break in a canal, they could shut that lock up and still use the other sections of the canal while the repairs were being made. If you see the stones are falling out the bottom, now on the Susquehanna Division Canal, the stones were watertight themselves. They weren't lined with wood. They were laid up on wood. Wood went across this way, and they laid the stones up on it. Now that the water is coming off the wood, now and then the wood is rotting and the stones are falling out the bottom of the locks, and that's what's happening there. And that's down in Shady Nook campground area down there. This is Keller's Boatyard in Sealants Grove. They manufactured boats there, and a lot of their boats were just empty hulls used to haul coal or lumber. They didn't really have cabins on or anything. They're like a bathtub almost. And here, I like to say the men are caulking the boats here is what it looks like. The boats are just about ready to be put in the water. He was famous for building boats for the Munchunk Canal called Snappers, that boatyard there. This is a Penns Creek Aqueduct. It was 400 feet long, and again, this was a water-filled bridge that the boats went across. Travel across this way. This is later years. You can see the one section's gone. Now this is down at Mahantango Creek on the way to Harrisburg on the Susquehanna Division. Across the creek there And you can see one of the piers for the aqueduct right here. And later years, earlier years, when I get there, the other pier was here too. And eventually this pier will be gone too. The water taking its toll on it. This is a hotel down that way. It was built by Conrad Weiser's family, one of the family. It was called Weiser's Frawley because it was built like in the 1880s and the canal stopped about 20 years later. Now it's used as a tire recycle place, but you'll see it on the right-hand side as you're going to Harrisburg. This lock was right there at that hotel. Like I said, they always had a hotel at the locks because when they would shut the locks down at 10 o'clock at night, you couldn't travel any further. Then the people would go stay in a hotel if they didn't want to stay on the boat. Of course, there was food and drink at the hotel. There you can see where the doors went back against again, so they'd have the clearance to get the boats through. You can see the size of some of these trees that are in these locks today. This pond over here was immense at one time. It was a reservoir that they stored water in case they needed some water in a canal. They could let it back into the canal. Here's another picture of that lock. Here again is where the doors went back against. You can still see some of the hardware here for the door hanging. This is down inside the lock. Usually this has water in, but it was dry one time. We've had to be able to get down inside and take a picture. Now this is a picture down in Port Trevor. This is a double header, two boats chained together. During the Civil War, there was a manpower shortage, so the women started moving on in boats. And they actually tamed the canalers down a little bit. Started to see curtains in the windows, and they weren't as foul-mouthed around the children and everything, so it really did good for the canal and taming them down a little bit. But the captain would move on with his wife and children, and they had the women had a separate portion of the cabin of the boat to stay in. This is down in Port Trevor area. As you might know, that road has been raised down there. It used to be a lot lower. If you go along, you'll see a lot of the buildings, especially that little mill. So that's way down deeper than the road, and that's because the road was built up in here. The canal was lower and down by them buildings. Now this is Port Trevor's recreational field, and I used to really feel sorry for these people because it was wet all the time, but then as I started studying canals, I understand this was a 3-acre basin at one time, where they bring boats across the river on that bridge they had down there, and on the railroad, and bring it up around and come down this way and unload into canal boats. And there again is this clay puddling, kept that so it holds water tight even today. We're going to get into some ruins now of the canal. This is the ruins in Northumberland, days after the canal. This was a privately owned property right here, and they had like a little farmette there. Here's a picture of the Susquehanna Division later on. They did park coal dredgers in there. As you know, Van built one a couple years ago. He has it on display at Montgomery Park. There again is the towpath, and you see we have telephone poles now coming in, so this is after the days of the canal because they couldn't walk that towpath and drag a boat at this time. There's another picture of the canal, and the entrance. There's that little railroad station I was telling you about to catch to Lewisburg. Now this is Sanders Lock. We're going to be going up the West Branch now, and this was a guard lock. This is another lock that had one gate. There was nothing left of this at all except maybe a 2-foot section of that rounded area right there that you can still find if the weeds aren't too high. This is Hauser's Run. This was a pretty good turn in the canal. They usually didn't have this hard of turns, but this was one of the hardest turns in the West Branch Canal. And it was a famous swimming hole later years. This is Bill Meyer's Boatyard in Lewisburg. Right as you come off the Lewisburg Bridge where Pennsylvania House used to be, that was the canal boatyard. It was owned by Cipher and Frick. Frick also had a boatyard in Northumberland between 6th and 7th Street, a lumber yard. But these boats that they built here were built for the Lehigh Canal, which was 60% of Lehigh Canal was river navigation. These boats were too big to fit in our canal. And the way they used to ship them was in spring freshets and the floods. When the flood would come, that was when the goods would go down the river. Here's a picture of Port Jackson in Montana. There's an interesting railroad right here. The Lewisburg and Tyrone Railroad came right here. They went through this building here and came out this entrance right here, and there was a drawbridge right here. When the train was coming, they would stop the canal boats, drop the drawbridge, and the train would come across. There wasn't very many trains in that day, so it didn't happen very often, but it's a very interesting part of the canal. Here's the mules, and they were wearing these harnesses that keep the flies off. They were manufactured in Milton. There was a big manufacturer there in Milton that made them. Now this is a cross-cut canal. When they built the canal, they built it on the east side of the river, and Lewisburg got very upset because they were cut out. Milton got afraid, Watsontown, but Lewisburg got left out. So they petitioned the legislature to build a cross-cut canal of their own. They built a dam here, 2.5 foot deep, high, to dam the water up. They built a bridge across here. This was a railroad and a pedestrian bridge shared. But the canal boats didn't come across this bridge. They were poled across and entered into the canal right here. You can still see by Mays Drive-In is where they entered into the canal. There was a sawmill operation right here. Now this is, we're up into Milton now. This is a lock in Milton on Cherry Street. This building stood until 1972 flood and they had to tear it down. A fellow by the name of Captain Fortney used to run that lock there, and when the canals closed down, he bought the property. They filled the lock in. He lived in that house for many years. This is a picture going through Milton. Now usually the canal was on the outskirts of the town, but in Milton they went right through the middle of town. And I read an interesting story in 1880. A fellow was coming down the canal and he got stopped outside of Milton. And they said, "You can't go through, Milton's on fire." So he waited there for 5 days. Not because the fire lasted for 5 days, but because the people that lived in Milton threw their personal belongings into the canal to try to save them from the fire. And the fire actually acted as a fire break and saved some of Milton, but there was over 600 buildings burned in Milton at that time. That's why if you go up there, you'll notice most of the buildings are brick today. This is Cape May, which is up by the Watsontown Brick Company on the West Branch. These are two boats chained together again. Now that canal didn't have provisions for double boats going through the locks. They had to break them apart and go through one at a time. But they could travel the levels. They call, between the locks it's called a level. And they could travel those levels chained together. This is up in Muncie. Up in Muncie they had slack water navigation. The dam would have been down here. This would have been the chute, what I was telling you, where this Rafts River and arcs would go through. This is all lined with stone. You can't really see it. The towpath was right up here. The mules would walk up on that towpath. The boats would actually be in the river. This is Bob Kent's. He was the president of the Canal Society for many years. He passed away a couple years ago. This is Walden and Spott's coal yard in Muncie. This happens to be Captain Fortney's boat. They're pulling out a load of coal. And they have usually they use 2 mules, sometimes 3, but here we must have a pretty heavy load, and he has 4 of them there. Now this is a Hastings family who used to own the Milton Tribune in Milton. They're on a picnic. They had these little picnic boats. So it was like a packet boat, which you'll see right up there. You can come up later and see one. They hauled passengers, and the bigger ones held as many as 150 passengers. And they could use horses and trot. They didn't have to go 3 miles an hour. The speed limit was 3 miles an hour in the canal, but the packet boats could go at a trot. They had right away. And if a freight boat was in the way, they had to pull over and let the packets go by. But this actually is a picnic boat, and they're going on a family reunion here. Here's one of those footbridges that go across the canal. Here's a work boat. Of course, there's lots of work to do in a canal. If a muskrat got busy and dug a hole in the canal bed, it would start leaking, and these people would have to fix it. In the wintertime, they would drain the canal almost completely so that the expansion and contraction of the ice wouldn't hurt the locks. And they became great swimming or ice skating areas. People would ice skate from town to town on the canals. Here's a boat loaded with, this is out of Albany, here's a boat loaded with lumber. You get an idea, this boat's 8 to 10 feet high. And then that lumber's piled up that high yet, so it's quite a load. This is a boat here, a lumber boat on the West Branch with raw lumber. Now remember, these were all loaded and unloaded by hand. So it's quite a job. They even had boats with sails on them. When you got down Chesapeake Bay, you would have to be towed across the bay. And it was a very bad situation because if they had 5 boats being towed and one of them would sink, it would drag the other ones down with it. So somebody got an idea to get a keel board and drop it down and put sails on it and sail across on their own power. These boats were the exact same size as the regular canal boats, so they could use the canals by dropping the sails and pulling the keel board up. There's actually one of them rebuilt and traveling the Erie Canal for the last couple of years. Now we're going to get into a little bit of the lock construction. This would hold the gates. This was called a gooseneck. And it was adjustable with nuts here to keep the beam tight against the stone that was rounded out. And a round beam that went down the gate was fastened to it. Here's those planks I was telling you about that were around. Now these planks are gone, but these are still here yet on this lock. They kept these in with these little wedges. This piece right here was about 10 to 12 feet long, and they would incorporate that when they were building the lock to hold these. And then they would put these wedges in and pound them with a sledgehammer to get them tight to hold the lumber in, that they could plank it. You still see them very often in the canal locks. These are called staples. They use these on the top rocks. They would drill a hole into the rock, they would put the staple in, and they would fill them with lead to keep them tight. That's because they walked on those stones so much. Here you can see some staples here, the gooseneck and how they held the gates. This is on the Union Canal. This was restored in 1976 for the bicentennial. But this is the condition it's in now, about maybe 10 years ago. But these beams here, you can push these with one finger. They're balanced so nice. This is called mudlark. When they would drain the canal in the wintertime, if your boat happened to be in the canal, it just settled down to the bottom into the mud. And you stayed there until spring till they filled the canal. Now you could take the freight home on wagons, or you could lock your canal boat up and come back in the spring. But they did both ways. But this is actually settled down to the bottom of the canal here. This is our bridge coming into Northumberland, caught on fire June 2nd, 1923. It was the end of our bridge there, the covered bridge, which was built in 1831 by Reuben Fields. This is how they built the bridge. They used timbers and they used rocks. You'll see as I go across here how they constructed it. Here again, timbers, rubble, stone. Then they would start building the pier up from that rubble, stone, and timbers. That's the piers that go across the river now. When the water's low, you can see it. This is actually a boat somewhere around Schuylkill, but it gives you an idea how tight they were in the lock. You can see there isn't much room, which was good for the hydraulics to raise and lower them. It's Monday, wash day. In those days, Monday usually was wash day. They would carry their own water because the water in the canal wasn't fit. This was a feed box for the mules, and they would use that as a permanent refrigerator. The early boats that you see up here had a cabin in the front and a cabin in the back. The cabin in the front, they carried an extra set of mules to relieve the ones on the towpath every now and then. After the railroads bought them, they built stables by the locks, and they kept the mules there so they didn't have to carry mules, so they normally only had one cabin in the middle. These are called snubbing posts. When the boatsman would bring the canal boat into the lock, he would have to stop that before he hit the lock doors, or he'd get fined by the lock tender. They would throw a rope around these snubbing posts and slow the boat down to keep it from hitting the doors. There was quite a few fines. I have rules and regulations of the canal. There was lots of fines on the canal for doing things the wrong way. This is a Nighthawker. I happen to own this. I got it from my father-in-law. He bought it in the 1950s from the SB boatyard it was supposed to have come. They had a reflector here and these two mirrors. It would actually light up the 40 feet across the canal. I've tried it already. It lights up really well. And you can actually see where you were going. If they could get past the lock by 10 o'clock at night, they could travel to the next lock. And some of the levels were 13 miles long, so they could get a jump on getting the freight where it goes. Just like truck drivers used to be, they had to hurry to get there, to get the load there. The quicker they got there, the more they got paid. So similar with the canals. They could make about 6 or 7 trips a year. The canals weren't open in the wintertime. They shut them down usually about Thanksgiving and open them back up in end of February, beginning of March, depending on how the weather was. Now this is Rolling Green Park. After the days of the canal, they had a boatman's reunion over there. First they started out in Newport, Liverpool, and then they were canceled for many years. In 1889, a fellow by the name of John Sheets made these canal boats. They're about 10 foot long, and when they started having the boatman's reunions in Rolling Green Park, they would put these boats in Silver Lake there at Rolling Green Park when they had the reunion. These boats now, they sat at that Port Trevorton Basin for years and years, and somehow they were given to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, and somehow they ended up being sold to a buffet restaurant, and they were on both ends of a salad bar for many years. Our Pennsylvania Canal Society rescued them, and this is what they look like today, one of them. They have one restored and one not restored. You can see this at Easton, Pennsylvania at the National Canal Museum. And here again, it's a company boat, one cabin in the middle, and they were always numbered. The private boats had names. This is a boatman's reunion pins. They used to sell these for 25 cents a piece to fund the reunions. I have probably the most complete collection of boatman reunion pins here in this box. You're welcome to look at. I only need, I'm not sure because of Warrior, 6 more pins and I have them all. They ran from 1915 at Port Trevor and Bowling Green until 1956. At one time, there was 15,000 people attending them reunions that belonged. Anybody that worked the river or the canals were allowed to come with their families. Here's some of the pins. There you can see Captain Fortney. They put the mules on them. They put canal scenes on them. They put lock tenders on them. And later on, they were just plain like this, and they were called ex-boatmen reunion, or Sons of the Canal later on. This is one of the boats after the days of the canal, and when the dam got washed out in 1902 at Shamokin Dam. That was the end of the canal going to Clark's Ferry. So they really cut them off with the freight. By that time, the railroads were coming in strong, so they were really overtaking the canals anyhow. But these canal boats set here and there. They scuttled them in quarries. Some people took them out of the river and made homes out of them. They took them apart and used the lumber. There's only one half of a packet boat that I know of in existence, and one 10 by 10 piece of an actual canal boat off the Lehigh down in Pottsgrove or Port Clinton that still exists. This is the lock number 1 I showed in the North Branch Canal. About 5 years ago, I got a vegetation management agreement with the Seatacoga and the Railroad Authority, and we went in there and cleaned the trees away from the sides of the lock walls so they wouldn't collapse the lock. And I had help from Susquehanna University fraternity. We had about 40 people there. It was 23 degrees outside in January we did this. But it will help preserve the lock for years to come. This is one of the canal markers. Now everybody calls these mile markers, but they weren't actually canal markers. They only put these where they had disputes with bordering properties. It stood for Pennsylvania Canal, and they were about 4 feet high if you get them intact. I have one that's intact and 2 that had been broken off that I had bought off of people that took them off the canals way back. I still know where there's a few on the canal, but I don't urge anybody to take them out of their location. But what happens is they're very heavy, and it gets wet, and they just actually sink and disappear. This is an art drawing that Sidney Davis drew, and I had this to explain how they overcome elevation. You can see here's the low water, here's the high water. The boat would come into the lock, they would shut the doors behind them, they would open wickets in the high side, would flood the chamber, raise the boat up in the air, and when the water was the same on both sides, they could move those balance beams, open the gates, and the boat could continue on its way, overcoming lift. The general lift was anywhere from 1.5 feet to 20 feet down on Eastern Division. They had one called the Pig Pen, which was 20-foot lift. The lift at Northumberland was 13.5. The first lock on the Danville branch here, the North Branch, was 9.5 feet, to give you an idea how they lifted the boats. The elevation to overcome was 80-some feet from here to Clark's Ferry, to give you an idea. This is the last slide in my program. This is the captain on the tiller. He's coming down the West Branch Canal. And that's going to be it for my program. I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have about the canal. I always tell people if I don't know the answer, I have more fun trying to find it. So you're welcome to come up and look at the artifacts here. I think John will be starting here in 10 minutes, so we have time for some questions.
Was there a charge for the locks also?
For the locks, there was no charge for the locks.
That was included with the toll houses?
Yeah.
Okay.
But the lock tender did have a store there and a garden and sell merchandise and stuff to make it.
Oh, okay.
He got paid $20 a month and worked from 5 till 10 o'clock at night. 5 in the morning till 10 o'clock.
Now, did they stay with the boats all the time when they were in season?
Yeah, they would make continuous trips, one right after the other.
Yes.
They got paid about 60 cents a ton to carry the freight.
So if you worked on a boat, you worked there the whole summer, you didn't?
Yeah, you didn't. Now you took off. Sometimes if you got into a lock and had to wait, you had enough time to run to the store and buy some tobacco or something or a treat. Ice cream was a big deal in the canal. Some spots they had ice cream, and they would always talk about getting ice cream and stuff. And they had canal boats that carried merchandise too, like a store. It would come down through and sell wares to people. Yes, ma'am.
I would assume that they weren't the ones that had to take all of that stuff off of the boat, right? They would have other people on shore.
They hired people to do it, but they did sometimes have to do it themselves. Some of it, yeah. And some of it got taken off at different areas. Maybe you were shipping something to Danville, and then you would drop something off. Then you go to Nanticoke and drop something off. The coal boats were the ones that went to the place and had to be unloaded all at once. Or iron ore or coke or something like that. The heavy goods.
How far downriver did they go?
downriver. They went to all the way down to Columbia, Riceville, and then they caught the Tidewater or Chesapeake Canal there, and you could go all the way to Chesapeake Bay. And the North Branch Canal here, later on, through a private junction, hooked up to the Erie Canal. So there was over 1,300 miles of canals in Pennsylvania. And we had the distinction of having a canal boat higher than anywhere else in the world because of the Allegheny Mountains. I didn't cover that, but when they started building the canals across the state, they didn't know how they were getting across the Alleghenies. They had idea of tunnels and everything, but they made a portage railroad where they would pull one boat up as they lowered another one with steam engines. And that transversed the Allegheny Mountains, so we had a boat 1,300 feet in the air. Any more?
It's like I thought one of the earlier talks about the mules when they would
You have to speak up just a little.
well, the mules when they would change because of the pulling.
Oh, yeah,
on the necks and stuff. I thought it was
When the reason they changed the mules from one side of the canal to the other occasion is because if they walked all day long, pulling on this side, when they unhooked them at night, they walked sideways. So they would try to get them on both sides now and then so that they would be normal. And the reason they used mules is because they wouldn't drink bad water, and they wouldn't jump in the canal like a horse might. So they were stronger and more durable, lasted longer. Any more questions? Well, thank you a lot.
Thank you.
And you're welcome to look at these things.